All right, good. We're back here with Liberation Library. We have a special guest once again. We've had her before, and glad to have Dr. Diller here again. We're going to be talking about the book, The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. And Dr. Lisa Diller is a professor of history at Southern Adventist University. She's also very active with Adventist Peace Fellowship and a number of other things, aren't you? Are you still like co-pastoring a church?
Oh, I'm an elder
Okay,
and frequent preacher at my church. Yes.
okay,
Amen.
okay,
Amen.
good. All right, so it was kind of funny. I definitely had the Color of Compromise on our list for the Liberation Library before we even emailed about it. I was like, wow. And I was so glad when you emailed and said, hey, can I do that one as well? It's like, yes, excellent. And to tell the truth, at that point, I was maybe about a third through the book. And because this was a book that was difficult for me to read, I had to read it in stages and I had to put it down because, especially like, I think about the first third of it, there's some really graphic
Hmm.
violence. Yeah. But I'm talking too much. We have a guest here. Go ahead and jump in here, Lisa.
This is one of the sad things about teaching history in general, um, is how much violence there is. And as someone who works for peacemaking and wants to think about um, tamping down the way we center violence in our world, it is and dealing with students who have trauma, who are triggered by these things. Whenever we're talking about the difficult things in history, I'm facing that, to be honest, right now in my women's history class, where so much of what we're talking about has to do with violence, and it can be very upsetting, especially to these young people. And I do think we have to all the time, we want to celebrate what has been done, what has been overcome, have people we look up to, even as we're telling the truth about the really hard things that happen. And I do think you're wise to engage in spiritual care while you do that, to engage perhaps in the historical and Christian practice of lament. That we have passages in Scripture that kind of help us do some of that well. So yes, I am sorry about the ugly truth of this. I have to say, yeah.
Talk, you mentioned the word lament in there. I want you to help us with that. I've read a couple of pieces focusing on lament. I'm thinking of Sun Chan Ra and his prophetic lament. Talk to us about lament and lamentation. I mean, of course, there's a Bible book named Lamentation, right?
Yes. Yes.
But you know, uh, what does that mean to you as a history professor, as an elder in your church, somebody who preaches? What does
Right.
unpack that word?
Well, I think I'm going to be relying. I'm actually going to get my notes out here since I have them on a talk I heard at the Conference on Faith and History panel at the American Historical Association meetings this year in New York City, and I heard a great speaker, who is a teacher at a Christian, I think in the Catholic tradition college in the Maryland area, talk about. And he said he's the only Black faculty member at that school. It's a small kind of Christian college. So he is often put in the position of having to speak. And the audience was probably heavily Christian, I would say, but not only. And it was historical practice as lament. And he laid out the structure of lament as it is in the passages of Scripture in a way that I've not done that work myself. He says first you have an address to God, and you kind of are acknowledging who He is when you're doing lament. And
Okay.
then the actual kind of core of the lament is the second element, which is kind of the list of problems. Here's the stuff going wrong, kind of in the world. And then the third element is the confession of our trust in God. in spite of these negative things. The fourth is our petition. So, what are we asking for?
Mm.
After we've laid out kind of the problems, we've acknowledged who God is. Um, and it ends, he says, and he's done the scriptural work on all of this, with a vow of praise. Like, so, in some ways, though he slay me, yet will I trust him,
Mm-hmm.
sort of acknowledgement. Lament is different than confession. Confession is also a Christian practice that we need to also be engaging in, I
Mm-hmm.
think, collectively and individually. But lament doesn't necessarily lay blame. Okay. So, this is part of why I think it's so powerful for Christian teachers and speakers. And I'm going to bracket for a second my role as a historian, but say for Christians at a Christian school, when you're dealing with really terrible things that happened in the past, and I'm just going to say as honestly as I can, when you're dealing with students that some of whom, especially I'm going to say white students who might feel terrible about bad things, not sure, like, am I supposed to feel guilty about that myself? Like, what am I supposed to do about that? How much sort of guilt do I need to take on versus not, or defensiveness, I didn't do this,
Mm-hmm.
so when you're dealing with that, and you're dealing with students who this is not anything in their background, students from different countries who are coming in, this isn't their thing, like
Right.
we just immigrated here
Right.
15 years ago, I don't, what.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a range of students. Lament is a way of saying, this is terrible that this happened, these terrible things happened, let's name them, and let's ask God to, let's acknowledge the pain that they are and acknowledge who God is and basically sit with it. We might ask God to heal some things, but
Hmm.
lament is a more of a sitting with the terror, the sitting with the difficulty, the acknowledging of it.
Hmm.
And then you're not casting blame, you're not asking for confession at this point right
Mm-hmm.
here. There may be other times when we confess, and I think that is useful as a pedagogical tool
Mm-hmm.
as a teacher, because it doesn't ask any of the students to either take on blame or even to say, yeah, this is my reality, I'm suffering, this is my trauma, in some ways, because it might not be, and that's okay. But it's also acknowledging the truth about the past, the truth of who God is, and the truth of what happened in the past. As a historian, I just want to say quickly, it's very important, because otherwise, all we're doing is talking, it feels like, is like all this bad stuff that happened
Mm-hmm.
in the past. And so, as a Christian historian, I can say we can do more with this than just list all the bad things. We can bring this before God.
And I like what you address with what takes place when, in this practice of lamenting, is actually acknowledging what has happened was wrong, it is horrible, and it just addresses the events and the acts rather than immediately connecting them to a group of people or institution. It's just simply addressing, man, this is horrible and this is bad. So I think that is important. So we can effectively and I guess rightly go to the next phase of what is addressed in this book as far as like confession.
Right. I'm kind of stuck in something that you said, Dr. Diller, and well, just the essence of what you said reminds me of different phases of the biblical narrative. So you have the book of Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
especially where the Hebrew people have fallen on, they're in slavery in Egypt. There's a Pharaoh pretending like he never knew that Joseph was a person, that he wasn't instrumental to their history. Um, and you have, after the book of Exodus, actually starting in the book of Exodus, you have some holidays that develop, which were yearly and even weekly reminders of what they went through
Mm-hmm.
in Egypt.
Yeah.
All right, and so the weekly Sabbath was one of those things where every seventh day you're to rest, and you're to give everyone in your sphere of influence rest. And there's two different versions of the command for keeping the Sabbath, for resting on the seventh day. The first one is in Exodus chapter 20, and it says that the reason that you need to keep that day is because God created heaven and earth in 6 days, and he rested and gave man rest on the seventh day. All right, so you have creation as a reason for that. Then you also have in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, there's a reason given for resting on the same day. The command is basically identical, but there is a different rationale for why to keep it. He said, remember that you were a slave, you were in bondage in Egypt, and because you were there and I did this thing for you to bring you out of bondage, you are to keep the Sabbath and extend the Sabbath to others. Give them freedom. So then you add the yearly Passover festival, which was a celebration of God bringing his people out of bondage. Now, so when you have these weekly and yearly holidays celebrating deliverance, you can't celebrate deliverance without talking about what you needed deliverance from, right? So even there, even as we have celebration, there is lamentation that leads into the celebration. You've got to have, you have this thing that you need to acknowledge, or else the celebration is very hollow. But I did converse with you via email, and that we wanted to jump into
Yeah, let's get in it.
chapter 11, the fierce urgency of now, which of course has encapsulating from King that he would talk about very often, the fierce urgency of now. So we have the lamentation, we have the history all laid out. You really need to read this if you haven't, because it gets deep, and we'll probably return to some of that if we can. But the fierce urgency of now is talking about what do we need to do now? How do we move forward now that we've looked at we've lamented all of this history? Now what do we do about it now? Because we still have stuff going on.
And it hasn't been that long. Okay, so that's part of what, I'm now middle aged, so I'm older than half the people, in our society. And that this is why what the urgency of now is it's not just like there's an assumption here, and I think Tisby is potentially educating a Black America, let's just say it in that way. But his heart, and where he does a lot of his ministry in, is helping white Americans or other Americans kind of do business with this. So this is why the chapter on so what, right? With all of this, like, so what now? Now what do we do? This all terrible stuff happened, and it's still here. There's things that are going on. And one of his suggestions that he has that I think there is a tendency on the part of some of us who feel like, well, I didn't do this way. I don't feel personally racist. I have not personally exploited people. Why? What am I supposed to do? Don't continue to make me feel guilty about this. That there's, just being frank, that exists. And Tisby's call is, well, first of all, and what I appreciate is when you're talking about the Sabbath and these celebrations in the Jewish community, there are remembrances of terrible things that happened, and then there's celebrations about coming out of it. Now, we know that sometimes we can celebrate the coming out of it and whitewash the history, right? Part of what he's doing with Dr. King and other things like that. So we still acknowledge, but guess what? As a middle-aged, middle-class white lady, this is my celebration too. I get to celebrate Juneteenth. What if I got to say, isn't this an amazing thing that happened, that we decided to do this, that this happened after so long, and can we all celebrate? I mean, this should be one of the things we're most proud of as a country, that we ended this. Why wouldn't we all be celebrating this like we celebrate Labor Day and Veterans Day and, sometimes Indigenous Peoples Day, or whatever we want to, why wouldn't we want to be celebrating this major change in our laws and justice system, in doing this? So, those kinds of things, as well as his call to even think about reparations in a different way. Again, that's upsetting, let's everybody calm down for a second, before everyone gets riled up about what reparations can mean and what that looks like, and acknowledge that when we've had a long system of injustice, one of the things that happens, I think about this as a woman, where there's been a long system of women not getting included. If now we're like, you know what, we're going to reach out, we're going to have some special scholarships for women in this area, we're going to make sure we include that, that's a way of trying to do justice to a long system of justice not happening. He uses that great example of Zacchaeus, where God says, you exploited and you made money, you need to pay back 4 times.
Yes.
You're sorry, you're confessing. This is part of what it might mean. So for me as a white Christian, I continue to learn from, and I'd be interested in hearing what you are like the so what it is. And sometimes what I hear from people who've been disadvantaged or receive generational disadvantages because of racism in our country, sometimes they're like, look, I don't necessarily, like, I can't think about the reparations thing, but I would just like it if maybe we had some more systematic ways of thinking about this in education, or, and so he's got a little piece in there for all of us, I've learned from like when I listen to Austin Channing Brown and people are like, what can we do, to support Black women specific, and she'll be like, hire us.
Yeah.
Support our businesses. Don't ask us to give you our advice for free, over a cup of coffee, like pay for our advice, pay for our wisdom. So those kinds of, even when I think about quote unquote reparations, I think, well, am I looking at supporting, Black businesses and Black schools? I'll also just say, if I might, which doesn't quite address any of the things that we've been talking about, but something I've been thinking about a lot recently.
Yes.
Because we're doing in some of the history classes that I'm in, there was so much richness. I just took my students to African American Heritage Center, Cultural Center in Chattanooga on Friday, and was reminded of the richness of Black communities and Black churches and Black schools pre-integration. Not that they're not rich now. I'm not saying that, but there were these, that part of what segregation did is it made these very rich communities that were rich culturally and supported each other, and even the idea of racial uplift. And I know that that's part of what happens with kind of ethnic identity clubs and spaces on college campuses. And part of what I have to communicate to my young people, my babies, that just been around for a minute, and they don't is like, the beautiful kumbaya everybody here holding is, it's more complicated than that. Yes, there need to be spaces like and supporting. So this is to bring it back to the women, if you don't mind me, the women analogy.
Yes.
So women were not included in historical records for a really long time. So now we're trying to integrate women scholars, women important people into our history. But until we're fully integrated and fully part of the history, sometimes we need special spaces where we do like a women's history class, because our students don't always understand that they are learning women's history because it's so, integrated in with everything. We have these special spaces. And they say this is true as well for, I think for a lot of our minority histories, experiences, is we need special spaces and acknowledgement of that officially, until and unless such a time as it is fully integrated and we're all on board, which isn't the same thing as resegregating everybody. It's saying, Disney is partly talking about that too. Let's have seminaries, let's have classes, let's celebrate our Black churches, let's celebrate some of our official Black theology that our Black theologians have done that we all benefit from.
Exactly.
I benefit
Right.
As a white lady, I benefit from Black men as well as Black women and Latinx and, everybody. As a Christian, I benefit from that work. So I appreciate this notion that let's have some of these special holidays, some of these special emphasis, because we are so impoverished as the majority culture right now. And we need to kind of notice that when it's happening.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, that issues of segregation, integration, racism has to do with power. And so, and Howard Thurman, which is Black theologian, mystic, Christian mystic, pointed that out in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited,
Right.
You know, during segregation, a white person could go in and out of any space they wanted to freely, but a black person couldn't. So even with our own denomination, our own faith community, Adventism, during the segregated South, a white person, Adventist, if they wanted to go to a black Adventist church, they were free to come, will be welcomed and to fellowship, and they can go to a white church, white Adventist church. But a black Adventist, if they stopped at a white Adventist church, they had to keep on driving until they could find a black Adventist church. But that is important. If we truly talk about full integration, we're talking about sharing power. So we need, in our spaces, let's say at our universities, we need as many Latinx professors and theologians, women theologians, African American theologians, so it can truly be shared power in our spaces.
Right. So some of the references that Dr. Diller made in here comes from Tisby's section. Again, we're looking at the chapter, The Fierce Urgency of Now, from the book, The Color of Compromise. He makes several suggestions of what we can do to kind of repair. I mean, since one of the things he mentions in here is reparations, what's the word relationship? We're talking about repairing a situation, repairing a, we could call it a broken system, but actually, it's in a certain light, it's not a broken system because the system is doing what it was designed to do.
Mercy.
So it's not broken. What we're trying to do is how
down.
can we how can we work with an existing system that was designed to do a certain thing and overhaul it to do something it wasn't designed for in the first place. Make Juneteenth a national holiday is one of his subheadings, one of his recommendations in here. For those that don't know about Juneteenth, that's when, after the Civil War was officially over, that didn't mean that things were really over. Matter of fact, I mean, they still really aren't over, but you had Union soldiers that rolled up into Texas and said, hey, the war is over, and these slaves aren't your slaves anymore. They're free, all right? And if you're going to work them, you need to pay them, all right? And so these things happen, and this is looked at as a kind of like a 4th of July in the African American community, although many of us still don't know about this holiday. But I first came across it from some people that I met from Louisiana. I was living in the Kansas City area at the time, and I mean, they were getting geared up with the grill and all of that. I mean, they're doing it up like it's 4th of July because they didn't do 4th of July. And I was like, hey, I was just being educated about it. And it makes perfect sense for us in the black community to recognize June 19th as a holiday, but for it to be a national holiday, I love that concept because it will help get a fuller picture of American history and what it really, if we're extolling the freedoms of America, we need to recognize that America wasn't made free at July 4th. It was freedom for white Europeans from the British Empire, but it wasn't freedom for other people that were on the continent. So Juneteenth as a national holiday, then there was
Take down the Confederate monuments.
the Confederate monuments.
Amen.
Thank you. Yes. The Confederate monuments. I mean, this is something that Germany got right. Okay, they said, you know what, some horrible stuff happened here, and we don't want our country to go back to that. We want, you will get arrested in Germany. I mean, people have been arrested. Even tourists have been arrested in Germany for doing a Nazi salute, thinking that is cute or something. They post it on social media, and they get carted off. but we have people doing it proudly here. Um, and we have people, I mean, even our own military will honor Confederate generals. Like, our military honoring Confederate generals when this, was against the U.S. Army, the U.S. military. So, but the reparations thing, that's, I want us to bring that back out because one of the funny things I think about when I think about reparations is United States believes in reparations to certain areas. I mean, why all of the heavy monetary and military investment in Germany? Because we believed in reparation. We helped repair Germany and build Germany up. All right. We believed in reparations to Japan. We helped build them up and put monetary and military investment in there. And we helped Israel and continue to help them with quite a bit of money and military aid because of the atrocities of the Holocaust. All right. And so we, there might be other agenda in there, but that's what we identify. Hey, this horrible thing happened to them. These people need their space because they have been historically oppressed. And so we're going to help protect them. We're going to continue to lend aid on a regular basis.
And I was wondering myself, Dr. Lisa, as pastors, elders, professors, or church institutions, what are some steps that the church can take? Maybe on a large, division level, general level, or maybe even a local church level. What can we do as far as being repairers of the breach, helping to give some type of reparations or bring some type of healing to our communities? What are some things, practical things that we can do?
Well, I think we are blessed as an Adventist church because we are so much more diverse than our wider society. So in some ways, but we also have to acknowledge our collective past. We just put up on Adventist Peace Fellowship on our social media. We just honored a great Black evangelist in the late 19th and early 20th century who fought the racism in the Adventist church and finally had to leave the church along with several of his local congregations because that was for him. Some people can work for justice and stay, and some people feel like they must go. I think we have some confession to do with regards to how we sort of drove people out of our denomination. I don't, when thinking about a division level, I'm reluctant to think about programs on a division level like that. What could be released potentially is either support, resources, training for more of a local kind of thing, because I think Tisby is really working towards the church and saying, how do we do ecclesiastical reparations? That's very important for him. And he, some of the things he talks about it is, again, we have Black communities that have tons of talent and ideas, but they don't have financial resources frequently. And finding places where we can build up, not just stuff that's going on in our church, not only Black Adventists, but in our communities that we're part of, what's going on in there that we could come alongside and support. We don't run it, we don't, but we support it. Tuition breaks, he talks about, because for so many in our segregated school systems that have resulted, ironically, from integration, so that we're more segregated almost now than we were in some places before the 1970s. And so people don't have access to a good education. Maybe we have tuition breaks that are sort of, if you're from a neighborhood where housing values have been low, and there's metrics you can use for this. We don't have to invent it ourselves.
Right.
Where we support not only businesses, not only tuition, scholarships, promotions. I'm sad. So what I've noticed, I will just say, is how few of our traditionally African American descendants, Black students who are from this country going back generations, as opposed to newer immigrants. And I don't want to split hairs there, but when I think about that, I think about how many of them are being really encouraged, like first or second generation college students, to go into professions that are good, but we're missing the artists and the historians and the sociologists and the people who are doing really important academic work, partly because people like, we need to be lawyers, so I'd like to see us supporting more, but even within our church, of people that have been and traditionally, like, who are trying to jump over 2 or 3 generations of privilege to get to the people who have got the leisure to say, well, I can be an artist or a social activist because I'm not paying off tons of student debt, trying to like help my family, all of that sort of stuff. So I think there's some really creative ways that Tisby has, that if we were to say, how can we acknowledge how we have benefited, and at the expense of others,
Mhm.
honestly, straight up,
Yes.
at the expense of others, even if we didn't mean to,
Mhm.
even though we didn't know about it, even though it wasn't my fault, it was generations past.
Yeah.
Right.
What is it they say? It's not your fault, but you're responsible.
Yes.
This is what
Mhm.
Brene Brown
Wow.
likes to say. It's not your fault, and you're responsible. And so if we can acknowledge that, I think it can be helpful.
Thank you so much again. That's a good place for us to break off. Again, it's The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby, forward by Lecrae for anyone into gospel hip hop, and
Shame.
and
Shame.
reviewed by Dr. Lisa Diller from Southern Adventist University and Adventist Peace Fellowship. We thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you, Doc.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.